Good afternoon, JASA members and friends. We're delighted to welcome you at this month's midday Zoom webinar with Dr. Rosina Buckland, the Asahi Shimbun Curator of Japanese Collections in the Department of Asia at the British Museum, and Lead Curator of Samurai, the new and very exciting exhibition at the British Museum on view through May 4th. Dr. Rosina Buckland was curator of the recent exhibition Japan's Festival Floats at the British Museum and has held previous positions as senior curator of East and Central Asia at the National Museum Scotland and curator of Japanese art and culture at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, Canada. Her publications include Samurai, the publication for the exhibition, and The Splendor of Modernity, Japanese Arts of the Meiji Period from 2024. Some of you may have already visited the exhibition or attended the February 19th Curator's Introduction online. Today, we will join Rosina as she introduces the Samurai exhibition and the collections of Japanese art of the British Museum for a specially framed talk for the Japanese Art Society of America. For those interested, please check the chat for information on the exhibition, programs, and its publication. And now please join us in welcoming Rosina Buckland as she takes us through the exhibition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'm delighted to be able to present to you and honored to be invited by the Japanese Art Society of America. I know many of the members, known you for many years, so it's a real personal pleasure to be able to share this phenomenal exhibition with you. I say that because it's been so well received. I've been overwhelmed by the positive response, and I'll summarize some of that this evening. As Amy explained, I've tried to frame this slightly differently from other talks I've given. Some of those are available on the exhibition webpage, which I'll give a link for at the end of the talk. I am starting with three images that I've been using while planning the exhibition to explain to the team within the museum the three sections of the exhibition. And I should emphasize from the get-go that I've always hoped to do an exhibition that went beyond the historical reality, the equipment, the objects used by the samurai. This is just as much about the representation and the image of the samurai, both created by the samurai themselves and by townspeople during the period when they existed and since their disappearance, their abolition in the late 1860s. So the exhibition is divided into three sections, and the first is fundamentally the samurai as warrior. So the image on the left of the screen here is a splendid suit of armor that we purchased for the British Museum in early 2025 from a dealer in Kyoto. And it has the crests of the Mori clan. So it's identifiable for the domain of Choshu down in southwest Japan, which was a powerful domain very much involved in the political machinations and instability of the 1860s. And it has a helmet with a signature of 1519 by the well-known armorer Nobuie, and the cuirass is signed and dated 1696. And then other elements probably would have been added later, the textile elements, and it comes with its storage box. So this introduces the exhibition. We have it in the introductory section, and we're using it as the image of the warrior, what people think of when they think of the samurai warrior, this man in very distinctive Japanese armor, usually holding a sword. But the main message of the exhibition is that the samurai were much more than that across history. They played very many roles. And we're hoping to surprise people with some of that new perspective. And then the second section of the exhibition, I should say that the period of warriors goes through from the rise of the samurai in the 900s through to 1600. 1615, that transition point to the Edo period. And section 2 treats of the Edo period, 250 years of peace, when the samurai are now narrowed down to administrators. They're not changing to administrators, but their roles narrow primarily to administrators, government functionaries, but they maintain the status of warriors, but the appearance is as this business suit type outfit from the 1800s, from the British Museum's collection, the Kamishimo. And then section 3 is about the afterlife of the samurai after that point of abolition in 1869, and all the ways that the image of the samurai, now that the concept is fiction and can be pulled and played with and used in many different ways, how that was manipulated and appropriated, both within Japan and across the world. And we have this fashion look from the streetwear company Undercover, Japanese streetwear company. So that gives you a taster of the range of the exhibition. I wanted to give you a little bit of context about the material in the exhibition, a prefatory explanation before I get into the themes and content in more detail. We have 40,000 objects in the Japanese collection at the British Museum, and you've got a breakdown of the different media there, rough figures. It won't all total up to 40,000. And there's a few or a couple of other categories in other departments outside the Department of Asia, beyond the Department of Asia. And the British Museum is one of 4 primary collections of Japanese material in the United Kingdom, alongside the Victoria and Albert Museum here in London, the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. And other institutions have interesting collections on a much smaller scale. Maidstone Museum, for example, and many stately homes across the country, National Trust properties, etc., have some Japanese material. And to give you a very, very quick taste of a quick idea of how the collections were formed, there was Japanese material, there were Japanese objects within the founding collection of the museum in 1753, when Sir Hans Sloane, the physician, arranged for a reasonably priced sale of his collection after his death to the nation, provided that a museum was founded, and that happened and opened in 1759. And he had purchased objects from the nephew of Engelbert Kempfer, who had been in Japan in the 1690s. So it's quite powerful to understand that these objects have been in Europe for 300 years. And then there was a gap of activity, and then in the late 1800s, the indefatigable curator, Sir Augustus Wollaston Franks, increased the collections across all areas phenomenally. There are 37,000 objects in the database against his name. About 10% of that were Japanese objects, and they ranged from porcelain and stoneware, I've given you a couple of examples here, to splendid Buddhist sculpture. Professor William Anderson in 1881 sold his tremendous collection of Japanese paintings collected on the ground in Tokyo and on various excursions around Japan, which has become the core of our very strong Japanese painting collection. And then Arthur Morrison, the novelist, sold his collection to Sir William Gwyn Evans, who donated it to the museum in 1913, a couple of the treasures there by Sesshu and Hokusai. This was 500 works, and there was well over 1,000 prints that he had also sold 7 years earlier. And then Robert Wiley Lloyd in 1958 gave a collection of around 250 swords, which we've drawn on for the project. And then in 2008, to bring it up to date a little, Professor Arthur Miller, who had taught at Harvard University, professor of law for many years, donated 1,800 Kuniyoshi prints. And obviously, Kuniyoshi being primarily an artist of warriors, this has also been tremendously important for the exhibition. These are all men. I did a lecture for Japan House London a few years ago where I managed to find one woman to include, but these have been primarily male collectors. Maybe that will change in the future. So to talk about the exhibition theme, the idea, the concept, I've often been asked in recent weeks why I did this topic. And the British Museum is not an art museum, so a specialist Japanese art exhibition isn't necessarily going to work. It has to be a bigger theme that will draw people in. And this word samurai is almost universally known. It has come to stand for Japan itself in some sense. People think they know what it means, but don't know the full story. So I thought this would be an interesting concept an interesting way to gather many things together, many different types of material from the collection and loans as well. And there have been many samurai exhibitions in the past, and I give you a selection here of some of the major ones. Some of the members of JASA will have been to these exhibitions, I'm sure. There's the Art of the Samurai that was focused on swords and some armor that was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. There were 2 exhibitions at the British Museum, again, both focusing on swords. And these have been very much that material, the equipment, the arts used by the samurai class, but I felt there was less examination, less interrogation of the image and the making of the image and the myth making. Some of you will also be aware of the spoof website that was created at the time of the Lords of the Samurai exhibition at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. And I mention this because it generated a lot of debate at the time, and it was a very important stimulus for me to think about what could be done differently in my exhibition. They were criticizing what they saw as the Disneyfication, this use of the Mickey Mouse imagery here. They criticized the lack or the omission of myth, militarism, and man-boy love. So this is to explain that my thinking was I should try to include all of these themes or to give them consideration and see how they would fit in appropriately. A little summary of the progress and the process of the exhibition. Since finishing my book on Meiji arts in 2022, delivering that manuscript, I've been working on this exhibition, and then over the past 14 months, we've been planning it in detail within the museum, the exhibition team working through concept design and then scheme design, as it's called, to develop the detailed cases. The British Museum has free entry, so as I was explaining, the special exhibition has to have a broad appeal. A specialist Japanese art exhibition in the blockbuster exhibition space, as we colloquially call it, 1,000 square meters, would be very difficult to market. So it has to have this recognizability. The primary audience for the exhibition is 18 to 35-year-olds, that hardest to reach group. And this has very much affected or influenced the design, that our aim is for the design to be dynamic, theatrical, engaging, immersive. There are 280 objects in the exhibition, and 75% of those are from the British Museum's collection, which I think is testament to its breadth and strength. 25% are loans from 30 lenders, and some of those are pieces that are on long-term loan to the museum already. It's not an armour exhibition, as I said. I've had several people ask me, how's my armour exhibition going? And they've got a scowl from me. As I said, it's to examine the history of representation and the myth as much as the equipment, and hoping to broaden people's understanding. And it's also been informed, or it's important to say that it's been informed by a 2-year international research project. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my talk. These are the 7 key messages that I used to explain the exhibition concept, theme, structure, that whilst our idea of the samurai has its origins in reality, this distinct warrior class that gained political dominance through the 1180s, through the Genpei civil wars, well, that's the first message. Secondly, the development of the samurai and their image emerged from the interaction between Japan and the world, and this is something that's become much clearer to me over the course of the research project, which has informed the exhibition. Thirdly, that throughout history, samurai engaged extensively in cultural activities as consumers, patrons, writers, scholars, poets, and painters. And this has been acknowledged in previous exhibitions. As I said, those arts of the samurai have often included that. So whilst all of that is known and understood, the contrast, or the unexpected aspect, is that from 1615 to the 1860s, it was a period of prolonged period of peace when samurai was a social class and half of the class was women. And this has been commented on a lot recently, but often not quite understood. This is a social class, this is the elite in charge of society, and the households are half women. The fifth message is that during this period, samurai men served as government administrators and women were running the households. And then subsequently, after the fall of the samurai, after the status of samurai had been abolished, by the 1890s, a myth was developing known as Bushido, or the way of the warrior. And this was co-opted during Japan's period of colonial expansion and military aggression. And as I said, I felt this was very important to consider and include. And then lastly, since the Second World War, the ideal of the samurai has been repurposed in Japan to promote new values and popularize worldwide as an image embodying a range of abstract qualities. These are the lenders to the exhibitions. I wanted to give you a range, an idea of the range of the lenders, and I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone who has contributed and supported to the exhibition to bring us some superb loans. And I will introduce some of the themes of the exhibition with key loans. This is a flavor of the appearance. It has been very busy. We've had 70,000 people through the exhibition already in 4 weeks, which I'm told is exceptional, exceptionally successful. And we are well on target for reaching our income, well on the way to reaching our income target and smashing those visitor figures, I hope. And the positive thing has been that the objects, the display cases seem to be sufficiently distributed that there isn't bunching. People can still get to the objects, even when it's at capacity for ticket sales, visitor admittance. There's been a lot of media coverage, just a selection of quotes there. We were we were thrilled to have some 5-star reviews from major organs in London. And I've done a lot of radio and TV, even one TV appearance to talk about the exhibition. So to introduce you to the 3 sections in more detail, this is a view of section 1, which, as I explained, is that period of warfare, the rise of the samurai, basically through government financial retrenchments in the 900s when a standing army was dissolved, and a rise of private warriors for hire, bows for hire, I should say, developed. And one of the main messages in this first section is that archery was the primary means of combat. I have 2 main subsections within section 1, 2 main themes. One is the samurai as warrior, and the other is samurai as cultural patron. So within samurai as warrior, we're emphasizing that the primary means of combat was mounted archery. The expectation is that combat was done using swords, but as this wonderful hand scroll from the John Webber collection in New York illustrates, we have a lot of arrows flying around. This is the attack on the Kanazawa fortress during the latter 3-year war in the 1080s. There are naginata, the long-handled glaives being used to decapitate enemies. Swords are being carried, but they're not used for hand-to-hand combat. Ideally, you want to stay some distance from your opponent. There's a fluidity to the samurai during this period. I get a lot of questions about who could become a samurai, were you born a samurai? And it's much more difficult to say in these early periods, because there were a lot of part-time fighters, part-time warriors. There was a trained elite who were practicing and exercising mounted archery, but beneath that, the smaller numbers of infantry troops in earlier centuries, and that number increased as time went by, they might be farmers some of the time, part-time warriors at other times. So the mounted archery elite are very important, and they are a stable, specially skilled stratum of society. And in association with that theme of mounted archery, we have the equipment that was needed for that, including the Oyoroi armor on the left, a wonderful example from Liverpool museums we've been able to borrow, a quiver from Venice of the later Utsubo type. We have an earlier ebira and then a later Utsubo. The Utsubo is a closed form, and a beautiful set of saddle and stirrups using the image of the dragonfly, which was symbolic of the samurai, associated with archery because the dragonfly flies straight to its target. And then we explain the evolution of armor, that we see this development of, or increase of infantry troops, and lighter forms of armor develop, such as the haramaki that closes at the back and the domaru that closes at the side, and a splendid example, courtesy of Ziz Limited here, of the haramaki type. There's a section on images of the samurai, and I'm keen for people to understand that whilst during this period the samurai were acting as warriors, they were very keen to, they needed to transmute brute power into legitimacy, and legitimacy came from the imperial court. So the self-presentation of the samurai is very much as sophisticated, cultured courtiers. And we have a wonderful portrait of the shogun, the 13th shogun of the second samurai government, the Ashikaga shogunate, on the left here. That's an important cultural property from the National Museum of Japanese History depicting Ashikaga Yoshiteru. And it was painted for his 13th annual observance of his death, which was in 1577. And he's wearing a gauze silk hitatare, translucent gauze hitatare robe. And we have other examples in the exhibition of paintings and sculptures that present the samurai as courtiers. They sought court rank, so they were officially accepted into the imperial court. The title of shogun was bestowed by the emperor. So this is an essential part of legitimizing what has been gained by force. Another wonderful example of how the samurai were being presented is this beautiful portrait of Ito Mancho, who was leader of a Christian mission. He was a young Christian samurai sent to the Vatican in 1583, and he and his three companions arrived 2 years later on a long journey west. And he was painted on his return journey through Venice by Domenico Tintoretto. So again, I thought something that people would not expect a samurai, or an appearance people would not expect of samurai. And then the theme I mentioned of samurai as cultural patrons, part of this quest to obtain legitimacy, to establish themselves, is to demonstrate mastery of cultural pursuits. And I'm showing here the wonderful robe from the John Weber collection for no theatre or no ritual performances, perhaps more accurately described. One of the many ways that the samurai elite were engaging with culture. We also talk about faith, engagement with faith, formal tea preparation. And accompanying the no robe, we have 3 no masks. One of these has an inscription on the back linking it to Yamanouchi Toyoshige, who was daimyo of Tosa domain, and it was required of the daimyo during the Edo period that they maintain troops of no actors. And we know that all 3 unifiers in the late 1500s, the sequence of warrior leaders who managed gradually to unify Japan under their power, they all participated in no either as musicians or actors. And as I mentioned, making sure that I was taking up themes that perhaps had not been mentioned in previous exhibitions that are more sensitive, more challenging. One of these is the topic of the Korean invasion, attempted invasion of the Korean peninsula by Toyotomi Hideyoshi in the 1590s. And we have this splendid surcoat in the British Museum collection that supposedly was owned by Toyotomi Hideyoshi and donated in the late 1800s. So we use this to introduce the character, the historical character, and then we have a couple of works, 3 pieces that talk about the attempted invasion of Korea and the brutality that was experienced on the peninsula during that event, and the forcible relocation of potters to Kyushu, which helped kickstart the porcelain industry down in southwest Japan. And then section 2, we have a brief explanation of how Tokugawa Ieyasu managed to unify Japan, achieve that final victory, and establish a government that did result in peace. Nobody knew whether the peace would last, but it did in fact last for 250 years. And the mood of the exhibition here changes from that dark space associated with warfare. We're now in a lighter space, and this is trying to evoke a street scene. We're hoping to evoke a street scene. We have I should mention there was a soundscape in section 1 for warfare. There's a soundscape in section 2 that has street sounds, market sounds. And then at the end of this space on the right, there's more of an interior space where interior activities are displayed. So we explain in this section, as I mentioned at the beginning, that the samurai are running the country. They are the government ministers and officials. Their roles are divided into civilian and military. On the military side, you have roles such as guards, firefighters, and then on the civilian side, you have the government ministers, the tax collectors, the land surveyors, the lawyers, the judges. There's a wonderful print in the British Museum collection by Katsushika Hokusai, thought to be his final sheet print, that depicts, the text discusses a mathematician and two of his students who have graduated, and the image presents the land surveyors who are out in the landscape with rulers and theodolites. And the bottom right there, you can see men using theodolites, because surveying the land, mapping the land is an important part of gauging tax yield, rice yield, and taxing the land. I've included here an image of falconry. We emphasize that the samurai class had to continue with their military practice during this time, even if they're not actually fighting. Archery is the high status occupation, high status activity. And we have an image here that was an interesting result of research and assistance from colleagues in Japan, identifying this as being by the artist Okamoto Zennetsu Toyohisa. It had been mistakenly identified as the more famous ukiyo-e artist Toyohisa, but this Toyohisa Zennetsu was known for his falconry images and worked closely with the shogun Tokugawa Yoshimune. And then an archery set on the right-hand side that I've likened to perhaps somebody receiving a car on their 16th or 17th birthday, this high-spec set of archery equipment. It has the Tokugawa crest on it, so obviously for a high-status man. And this again has been an interesting, it's demonstrated progress because the conservation process revealed that the object had been mistakenly assembled. There were pieces missing that were located in storage. It was all put together, and you can see this band, this leather band that holds the bows in place. So it's been a lovely sense of achievement to get this object back together in the right configuration. And then half the samurai class being women, we represent in the exhibition in a few areas. It's harder to find, it has proved harder to find objects that speak to that directly, but we have a wonderful lacquered palanquin for a wedding procession lent by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this is identifiable as for a wedding procession because it has the pairing of crests. There is the 9-star Hosokawa crest on the door and the Tokugawa crests on the door. And then on the uprights of the windows on all of the sides, the Hosokawa crest is repeated. So we assume that this was for Hosokawa bride. And then on the right, a piece in the exhibition that has drawn a tremendous amount of attention and admiration, the ceremonial firefighting jacket for a woman, probably most likely in the women's quarters of Edo Castle. And this was an area where men were not permitted to enter, and the women were responsible for extinguishing fires, which were always a terrible hazard of Edo, a wooden city, with splendid embroidery of gold-wrapped thread and applique silk. So the idea that there were women in the samurai class is new to people, and that they had these splendid objects and surprising roles has been a great interest. We return here to the idea of samurai as cultural patrons, as tastemakers, but also as artists themselves. The painting on the left is one of 6 in the museum by Hokusai, and I've used it to talk about the more effective pleasures of samurai life. There's a section on love, basically, samurai love, the Yoshiwara pleasure quarter being created for all of the samurai retainers who were traveling to Edo. There's a shunga book that we know was owned by the daimyo Yanagisawa Yoshiyasu. And this splendid painting by Hokusai of a beautiful young man in a long-sleeved, quite female reading furisode robe, possibly for a male patron, possibly the painting created for a male patron. And then the image on the right has been another interesting result of research. We knew from the inscription on the exterior of this painting that it was by the wife of the daimyo of Fukui province. So we talk in the exhibition about how high-ranking samurai were very often accomplished in painting, poetry. They were authors, they were scholars, engaged in intellectual activities. But through research, I was able to identify the artist as Sadahime, who was the younger sister of the senior councillor Matsudaira Sadanobu. Excuse me, there's a mistake on the date there. That should be early 1800s. And then the final section of chapter 2 of section 2 of the exhibition is this idea of the representation of samurai, usually by the townspeople class, the beginning of this popularization of the samurai image that continues to the present day, that this is being used in mass media, which means primarily, well, basically means woodblock printed culture in the Edo period. But we're making the point that the same themes, the same stories can be found in elite status objects and in the affordable, mass-produced objects. So on the left is an armor surcoat with a design of Minamoto no Yoshiie, who is one of the heroes of that early period of warfare in the 1080s. And he's passing the barrier at Nakoso no Seki, which you can see the black lines of the gate there in the upper portion of the sleeve on the right-hand side of the image. And he's returning victorious from battles in the north, having suppressed a rebellion there. And he passes the barrier, sees the falling cherry blossoms, and composes a poem. And you can see, again, another beautiful example of very intricate, elaborate embroidery. And then on the right-hand side is one of 3 woodblock printed books that were designed by Katsushika Hokusai in 1836, suggesting the tremendous popularity of warrior images during this period. And this is again Yoshiie passing the barrier with just the falling cherry blossoms, alluding to the incident. And then section 3 deals with everything that happens from the mid-1800s as Japan becomes, the political situation becomes unstable, with the arrival of Western powers and demands from Western powers for Japan to open up. We have a brief explanation of those political troubles and some satirical prints that were representing it covertly. And then we move into the way that the samurai image was consumed both within Japan and abroad. And I have a couple of examples here of that foreign consumption of the samurai image. On the left is Count Henry of Bourbon, who was an Italian aristocrat who was one of the many foreign visitors to Japan in the late 1800s. And he spent 7 months in Japan, shipped back 1,500 crates of material that now form the collections of the Museo d'Arte Orientale in Venice. And this is a kind of cosplay, Victorian era or late 19th century cosplay. He had 2 portraits created, one in samurai armor and one in kamishimo, formal costume, which are both preserved in the museum. So we were thrilled to be able to borrow this piece. And then on the right is a suit of armor on a mannequin, a Japanese mannequin known as the ikiningyo, that we know was on display in the armory in the private home of the architect William Burgess, and then was donated to the museum in 1881. And this is the first time it's been on display since the late 19th century, we think, certainly restored onto its original mannequin figure. And it's undergone extensive conservation. And it's also displayed with the 2 swords that we know were on the figure when it was displayed in the late 1800s that were donated with it. And then moving into the more difficult part of the story, how the samurai image was appropriated and used to in support of the project of colonial expansion or wars that Japan was fighting in first in China and then in Russia. These were victories that surprised the world, and an explanation was sought, and this idea of Bushido was being developed, and as an equivalent to European chivalry was the way that it was explained and contextualized at the time. And this ideal of the samurai supposedly was available to all of the population, irrespective of class now. And whilst the samurai image seems to have been important to Japan's allies and enemies, our research ultimately concluded that it was not that commonly used within Japan. So we have three examples here where I wanted to show how it can be used by both sides. On the left, we have the film Know Your Enemy Japan, directed by Frank Capra, released in 1945, that has a sequence about the parasitical samurai and mentions Bushido, and we have a clip of that in the exhibition. And then two, obviously on the Allied side as Japan's enemy, and then on the other two images are Japan's the nations that Japan was allied with in the Axis alignment. A poster by Gino Boccasile from 1942 of a massive samurai smashing Allied warships, and then a German propaganda leaflet called Die Samurai from 1937, a period when an alliance was being considered, which then materialized as the Tripartite Pact in 1940. And because this is a very difficult story, very difficult part of history, I wanted to have a moment of reflection after the war and this idea that has become established of somehow the samurai being associated with the Japanese soldier, whether that was the case at the time or not. And we have three pieces, two of which are now in the British Museum collection. Hayashi Yasuo was in the Special Forces. So again, I thought this assumption by people that there's something samurai-like about the kamikaze troops, whether that's correct or not. I wanted to have a consideration or an acknowledgement of that in the exhibition. Hayashi Yasuo was inspired by his nighttime flights, his experiences, training for a mission on which he was never sent, and therefore he survived. And we're very grateful to have had this piece donated to the museum by Greg Baker Asian Art. Yoshida Kenji likewise was in the Tokkotai Special Attack Forces, and he called his entire body of work after the war La Vie, Seimei, or life, and this sense of having been spared, of having managed to hold on to life was very important to him. And then thirdly, Shinkichi Tajiri was a Japanese American who was sent to one of the internment camps, and in order to get out of the camp, he signed up for the army and was sent to the Italian front, which was particularly brutal. And he suffered a knee injury and was invalided out and thus survived. And after the war, he moved to Belgium and created the series of sculptures called Sentinel or Ronin, which he described as being guardians for peace. And then the final section talks about the explosion of fun imagery across the world. So extensive use of the samurai image within Japan, but also across the world in popular culture. And we have montages that are divided into four categories. All of this wealth of material is divided into four categories of hero, historical, revenge, and fun or fantasy. And there are movies, video games, TV programs, anime clips, public information films on screens, as well as contemporary art around the room, and then examples of manga and other ephemera and toys that take samurai inspiration. The football team, the baseball team in Japan being called Samurai Brew and Samurai Japan, respectively. And then in the center here, I wanted to highlight the special commission for the exhibition by the artist Noguchi Tetsuya called Duck and Man. Some of you may be aware of Noguchi. He does wonderfully entertaining, whimsical works. His sculptures are fundamentally miniaturized versions of armor, very thoroughly researched, and he places them in surprising anachronistic settings. And this one is inspired by the rubber duck in the British Museum shop, which he discovered is the most popular item purchased in the museum, and is properly equipped with bow and quiver of arrows to emphasize that archery importance. And then finally, in the last section, samurai-inspired fashion, we have four looks by the four companies you can see there. And the Lanvin look was specially made for the exhibition. The artistic director, Peter Copping, met with myself and my project curator, Joe Nichols, and we sent him a package of images. He was attempting to soften this image of the samurai, he said, and this dress is structured as if structured taking inspiration from armor, but is embellished with paper clips and pen nibs to acknowledge the long role of the lasting role of the samurai as administrators. I'd like to wrap up by briefly describing the international research project that I've been running with Professor Oleg Benesh, who's head of the Department of History at the University of York over the past 2 years. And we have gathered together 22 participants from around the world working on various themes in Japanese history. And some of this, the results of this have materialized in the exhibition book. This is a screenshot of the columns that are in the book contributed by the research project participants. I wanted to highlight that there will be an international conference at SOAS. We're just getting the program finalized, so should be announcing that within the next few days. And there will be 2 special issues of the peer-reviewed journal Japan Review that's issued by the International Research Center for Japanese Studies in Kyoto, Nichibunken. And this is the shot or an image of the back cover of the first issue that will be coming out. There is a book that accompanies the exhibition. We're not calling it a catalogue because it's structured more like a book. It has 3 chapters of continuous text. And the exhibition runs until the 4th of May. I'm told that this is May Force because we have Darth Vader in the exhibition, although I haven't dwelt on him in my talk today. And I also encourage you to visit the exhibition website there that has some of the other talks and gives you information about the program. I very much hope you'll be able to come to London to see the exhibition. If not, please enjoy the videos and the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rosina, and from all of us here in the United States. We are so fortunate to be able to witness how you have provided a very, very deep understanding of the material you're presenting. And you're very, very modest to give credit to the hordes of people who have been working with you, and that is truly well deserved. But this is what a curator's role is, and your leadership in this particular project is just exemplary. And most of all, I think we all want to thank you for sharing in a way that is just not done all the time. Sharing, giving credit, but most of all, sharing your deep knowledge. And I think we learned today so many new ways to look at the samurai culture of Japan, particularly the samurai as patron, the samurai women and their role. I'm sure many of us can't wait to hear that very, very special program that will be provided as a Zoom presentation on the 5th of this month. I think we have a number of questions, and I think we'll turn over, if I may just go and ask them, not in any particular order, but from one of our attendees asking about the wakashu. Was the wakashu mostly restricted to the samurai class during the Edo period? How about the Heian period?
It's a very important question, yes. The wakashu is something that develops in the 1600s as urban society develops in Japan, in the large cities. It's not restricted to the samurai class. I mean, the choice to spend time with a wakashu is definitely not restricted. I think it's more of a economic means, and I didn't touch on this, but it's important for everybody to understand that there are different ranks of samurai, different income levels. They're not one thing, and we have a chart in the exhibition that is a notional explanation of that, because it's very difficult to make statements about the samurai even in the Edo period, or the bushi class as they're known in Japan, because it differed according to domain and differed according to the time. But fundamentally, I think if you have the money, you can spend time with the wakashu, and they're very much the object of desire by both men and women during the Edo period.
Thank you. Julie Sapin asks, could you address the formulation of Bushido in the 19th century in relation to earlier expressions of a warrior ethic? She says, I am thinking in particular of Miyamoto Musashi's Gorin no Sho,
Mm-hmm.
or the Book of the
Yeah,
Five Rings.
it's an absolutely fundamental question. And this is when I need Oleg Benesh here, because he has literally written the history of Bushido. It is very difficult to disentangle from the historical or the myth and the assumptions about the historical presence of Bushido. The problem is in the word itself. Oleg has been working on this for 25 years, so I give him full credit for everything I understand about this, and I would recommend his book, Inventing the Way of the Samurai, and some of that is distilled in shorter articles and in the exhibition book. There isn't a code called Bushido historically, and this is where it becomes complicated. There are things like Kyudo no Michi, the way of archery, and the path of archery, and other terms that are used in earlier historical documents. As I said, archery is a primary practice, so that gets a lot of emphasis. There are some texts that are written, such as Miyamoto Musashi's. Hagakure is the other one that's very well known now, but was a very minor text at the time that it was written, down in Saga, and was not published until the early 20th century, and that was when it gained greater renown. So its visibility now is almost in inverse proportion to how well known it was at the time. And then this formulation as Bushido is what develops in the late 1800s, and the one we acknowledge in the exhibition, the book we include, is Nitobe Inazo's, but there were other scholars that Oleg goes through in great detail in his book who were also using this term in the 1890s. Nitobe thought that he had invented the term, but others had actually come up with it. So it's very difficult to connect anything older to the Bushido that emerges in the late 1800s. And Oleg differentiates an imperial Bushido in the way that it gets used in the 20th century and then gets used for propaganda purposes. The only precepts really that are in play during the Edo period are the Bukke Shohato, the laws for the military households, which are based on Confucian precepts, and they're about correct behavior, not being profligate, daimyo mustn't associate with each other without the shogun knowing about it. It's nothing to do with ethics or a way of life as a warrior. So trying to connect the medieval reality and something that gets created or propagated in the late 19th century is very, very difficult. But please read Oleg's book.
Wonderful recommendation. And we have a very specialist question from Stephen Hochberger asking if any of the Nihonto on display are at the Juyo or Tokubetsu Juyo level.
The answer is yes. Some of them have been designated, but it's a relatively small number of swords in the exhibition because space was limited. We only have a certain number of stops that we are allowed in the exhibition. I didn't go into this much detail about the planning, but there is a capacity to the exhibition space of the number of people. They have to move through the exhibition within a certain time. So we were given 100 labels, and there's only a certain amount of pieces that we can fit in the exhibition. And I wanted to emphasize the archery and make it clear that that was much more important than the swords. But I would invite you to go to the British Museum's collections database, and it has predictive text. So I always encourage people to wait after they've entered a term. So put in sword, you can then filter it by Japan, and then you can also filter it by objects that are on display, and that will bring up everything that's in the exhibition.
It's amazing that you've gotten through so many objects this morning of the almost 300 in the exhibition. We have another question from Victoria Melendez. Did the concept of the samurai class originate during the Kamakura period?
Again, a very complex question because the And this brings me to the challenge of the word samurai itself, because samurai was not used in Japan typically. It's a word that appears in the medieval period from the word saburao, to serve, but it tends to have a more pejorative meaning of subordinate. And the warrior class, such as they existed, were the warriors were called mononofu or tsuamono. But as I said, there is this elite of mounted archers who have the time and the financial wherewithal to train. The infantry are going to be part-time warriors, so they're not fixed as a class. The warriors who have more power, social position, are the ones running the governments, staffing the Kamakura shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate. But it's very difficult to pin down this fluidity. And it's really in the late 1500s that Toyotomi Hideyoshi particularly issues edicts confiscating swords, and this is an attempt to lock down the social divisions, that only the bushi are allowed to have swords at this point. And bushi is the word that's used in the Edo period, bushi or bukkei, bukkei meaning households. And we have a copy of the sword hunting edict to suggest something of that bureaucratic nature of how this is being fixed, but also the social, not engineering exactly, but social fixing that's being attempted.
And finally, what would you consider the most challenging aspect of assembling the exhibition?
Money, I think, is a very short answer. It's financially challenging to stage such a large exhibition, so it's been very satisfying to see how well it's been received, and the excellent ticket sales. Loans are very expensive. They've become 3 times more expensive, I'm told, than before the pandemic. We're all worried about fuel costs increasing. Transport costs are very high. So we're tremendously grateful to the lenders who've done everything they can to make this smoother and more affordable for us, grouping consignments and that kind of thing. But we're very lucky that we've been able to use a large part of the collection. So frequently, when a loan fell through, I had to turn to the collection and find something that would speak to that theme, that story.
Well, you've given us a chance to really delve deeply into this thrilling exhibition. And really, while all the publicity talks about the aim to debunk some of the myths of the samurai, this is a show that is so much more, presenting a truly compelling spectacle of their world. And we are dazzled. Thank you so much. And we all thank you for this morning's presentation.
Thank
Before
you
we
very much.
close, we want to invite all of you in our audience to join us in person or online for our annual meeting and special annual talk by Megan Jones on Sunday, March 22nd at 12 noon uh, Eastern Time at the Japan Society at 333 East 47th Street in New York. It will be preceded by our annual lecture at 11 a.m. And the title of Megan's lecture is We Do Not Work Alone, Kawaii Kanjuro and Ceramics in Modern Kyoto. Megan, as you know, is professor of art history at the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University. Please note that this particular event requires signing up in advance. And finally, to our audience, thank you for joining us, and to all of us who are members of the JASA program committee. We thank you, Rosina. It was a wonderful, wonderful morning event for all of us. Thank you all, and we'll see you again soon.